Sarah Martinez had always been different from other girls in her small Texas town. While her classmates spent their weekends at the mall or gossiping about boys, she was reading military history books and practicing self-defense moves she learned from YouTube videos. Her father, a retired Army sergeant, had raised her with discipline and honor after her mother passed away when Sarah was just 12 years old. The tattoo on her forearm had been a source of constant mockery since she got it on her 18th birthday. It wasn't like the typical designs most girls her age chose, no butterflies, flowers, or inspirational quotes. Instead, Sarah had chosen something that meant everything to her, even though nobody else seemed to understand its significance. The design was intricate and military in nature. It featured an eagle with spread wings, clutching a trident in one talon and an anchor in the other. Below the eagle, there were 3 small stars arranged in a triangle, and underneath, a banner with Latin text that most people couldn't even read. To the casual observer, it looked like she was trying too hard to seem tough or had simply chosen something that looked cool without understanding its meaning. At Riverside Community College, where Sarah was studying criminal justice, the reactions were always the same. Her classmates would snicker when they saw it during warm weather when she wore short sleeves. Some would make jokes about her trying to be a wannabe soldier girl. Others would roll their eyes and whisper among themselves about how she was probably one of those people who pretended to have military connections for attention. The worst part wasn't even the mockery from her peers. It was the disappointed looks from actual veterans who occasionally visited the campus for career fairs or guest lectures. When they saw her tattoo, their expressions would change from friendly interest to barely concealed irritation. They clearly thought she was another civilian who had appropriated military symbols without earning the right to wear them. Sarah's criminal justice professor, Dr. Williams, had been particularly harsh about it during a class discussion about military symbols and their meanings. He had noticed the tattoo when Sarah raised her hand to answer a question about military ranks and had asked her about it in front of the entire class. "Miss Martinez," he had said with a slight frown, "that's quite an interesting tattoo you have there. Are you familiar with military insignia protocols?" The question had made Sarah's cheeks burn with embarrassment as 25 pairs of eyes turned to stare at her arm. She had mumbled something about it being personal and tried to pull her sleeve down, but the damage was done. For the rest of the semester, she made sure to wear long sleeves to every class, regardless of the Texas heat. The situation got worse when she started her part-time job at Henderson's Diner, a popular spot near the local naval base. The restaurant was frequented by active-duty service members, veterans, and their families. Sarah had hoped that working there might help her connect with people who shared her respect for military service, but instead, it became another source of humiliation. The first time a group of young sailors came in and saw her tattoo, their reaction was immediate and harsh. One of them, a petty officer with multiple deployment patches on his uniform, had actually laughed out loud when he noticed it while she was taking their order. "Hey guys, check this out," he had said to his companions. "This girl's got herself a military tattoo. What branch did you serve in, sweetheart?" When Sarah admitted she had never served, the atmosphere at the table became cold and unwelcoming. The sailors exchanged glances, and one of them shook his head in obvious disapproval. "That's not cool," another sailor had said quietly, but loud enough for Sarah to hear. "You shouldn't be wearing symbols you haven't earned." Word spread quickly among the military community that frequented Henderson's Diner. Sarah began to notice that service members would specifically request tables in other servers' sections when they saw her coming. The few who did end up in her section were polite but distant, and tips from military customers became practically non-existent. Her boss, Mr. Henderson, eventually pulled her aside during a slow afternoon shift. He was a kind man who had served in Vietnam and generally looked out for his employees, but he seemed troubled. "Sarah, honey, I need to ask you about something," he said gently. I've been hearing some complaints from customers about your tattoo. Now, I'm not saying you need to cover it up or anything, but maybe you could help me understand what it means to you? Some of our regular customers seem pretty upset about it. Sarah had tried to explain that the tattoo was meaningful to her, that it represented her dreams and aspirations, but she could see the confusion in Mr. Henderson's eyes. How could she make him understand without revealing the truth that she had kept hidden for so long? The breaking point came during a busy Friday evening shift. The diner was packed with the usual mix of families, college students, and military personnel. Sarah was working double time, trying to keep up with orders and maintain her usual cheerful demeanor despite the whispers and stares that had become routine. A table of Marine recruits who had just finished basic training were celebrating their graduation. They were young, probably not much older than Sarah herself, and full of pride in their newly earned status. When Sarah approached their table to take their drink orders, she noticed one of them nudging his friend and pointing at her tattoo. "Excuse me, miss," the Marine said with exaggerated politeness, "but I was wondering if you could tell us about your ink there. That's some pretty serious military symbolism you're sporting." The entire table went quiet, and Sarah felt her stomach drop. She knew this conversation wasn't going to end well, but she had nowhere to run. The diner was busy, and she had a job to do. "It's just something that's important to me," she said quietly, hoping to deflect further questions. "Important how?" pressed another Marine. "Did you serve? Because that looks like some specialized unit insignia to me." "No, I never served," Sarah admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. The reaction was immediate and brutal. The young Marines exchanged angry looks, and their leader leaned back in his chair with obvious disgust. "So you're just wearing military symbols for fun?" he asked loudly enough for nearby tables to hear. "That's pretty disrespectful, don't you think?" Other customers had started to notice the commotion. Sarah could feel eyes on her from every direction, and her face was burning with shame and anger. She wanted to explain, to tell them why the tattoo meant so much to her, but the words wouldn't come. "Look, I'm sorry if it offends you," she managed to say, "but it's not what you think." "Then what is it?" demanded the Marine. "Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you're playing dress-up with symbols that people have died for." The accusation hit Sarah like a physical blow. She had never thought of her tattoo that way, had never intended to dishonor anyone's service or sacrifice. But standing there in the middle of the crowded diner, surrounded by disapproving faces and whispered comments, she began to question everything. That night, after her shift ended, Sarah sat in her car in the diner's parking lot and cried. She thought about covering up the tattoo, maybe getting a new design over it or simply wearing long sleeves for the rest of her life. The constant judgment and mockery were becoming too much to bear. But deep down, she knew she couldn't give up. The tattoo represented something too important, too fundamental to who she was and who she hoped to become. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new stares, and probably new confrontations. But Sarah Martinez wasn't ready to surrender just yet. 3 months had passed since the incident at Henderson's diner, and Sarah had developed a thick skin toward the constant criticism of her tattoo. She had started wearing long-sleeve shirts to work and school, but the Texas summer made this increasingly uncomfortable. More importantly, hiding the tattoo felt like hiding a piece of herself that she wasn't ready to abandon. Her life took an unexpected turn when Professor Williams announced that their criminal justice class would be participating in a special field trip to the Naval Special Warfare Command facility. The visit was part of a program designed to give students insight into elite military operations and their role in national security. Sarah's heart raced when she heard the announcement. This was exactly the kind of opportunity she had been hoping for since starting her degree program. She had spent countless hours researching special operations units, studying their history, tactics, and selection processes. While her classmates saw it as just another educational requirement, Sarah viewed it as a chance to get closer to her ultimate goal. The morning of the visit, Sarah carefully selected her outfit. She chose a conservative blouse with three-quarter sleeves that would cover most of her tattoo, while still allowing some mobility for the physical demonstrations they had been told to expect. She arrived at the campus meeting point 30 minutes early, her notebook ready and her mind buzzing with questions she hoped to ask. As the bus pulled up to the naval facility, Sarah felt a mixture of excitement and nervousness. The security checkpoint was more thorough than anything she had experienced, with guards carefully checking everyone's identification and conducting brief interviews about the purpose of their visit. When it was Sarah's turn, the guard's professional demeanor reminded her of her father, and she felt a familiar pang of longing for his guidance and support. The tour began in a conference room where they were briefed on the facility's mission and the various units stationed there. The briefing officer, Lieutenant Commander Jackson, was impressive in his dress uniform, with multiple service ribbons and insignia that Sarah recognized from her extensive research. He spoke with the quiet confidence that she had come to associate with elite military personnel. "Ladies and gentlemen," Lieutenant Commander Jackson began, "you're about to get a rare glimpse into the world of naval special warfare. The men and women who serve in these units represent the pinnacle of military excellence, dedication, and sacrifice. I want you to remember that everything you see today is a privilege, not a right." The first part of the tour took them through training facilities where they observed candidates participating in selection processes. Sarah watched in fascination as potential SEALs pushed themselves through grueling physical challenges that would break most ordinary people. The determination on their faces reminded her of her own drive to succeed, despite the obstacles she faced. During the demonstration of combat techniques, one of the instructors asked for volunteers from the student group to participate in a basic self-defense exercise. While most of her classmates hesitated or declined, Sarah immediately raised her hand. The instructor, a tough-looking petty officer with multiple deployment patches, looked surprised to see a young woman volunteer. "You sure about this, miss?" he asked with a slight smile. "This isn't exactly a college self-defense class." "I'm sure," Sarah replied confidently. As she stepped forward to participate in the demonstration, Sarah rolled up her sleeves without thinking about it. The movement was automatic, something she did whenever she needed better mobility for physical activity. It wasn't until she heard a few gasps from her classmates that she realized her tattoo was now fully visible. The instructor noticed it immediately, and his expression changed from friendly interest to confusion, then to something that looked like shock. He stared at Sarah's forearm for several long seconds without speaking, which made the rest of the students turn to see what had captured his attention. "Where did you get that tattoo?" the instructor asked quietly, his voice carrying a tone that Sarah couldn't quite interpret. Before Sarah could answer, she heard familiar snickers from some of her classmates. Dr. Williams cleared his throat disapprovingly, clearly recognizing the tattoo from their previous classroom encounter. Sarah felt the familiar wave of shame and embarrassment beginning to wash over her. "It's just something personal," she said, starting to roll her sleeves back down. "No, wait," the instructor said, holding up his hand. "Don't cover it up. I need to see it properly." The instructor stepped closer, examining the tattoo with an intensity that made Sarah uncomfortable. Other military personnel in the area had started to notice the commotion and were gathering around to see what was happening. Sarah felt like she was under a microscope, with dozens of eyes studying her and passing judgment. "Can you tell me exactly what this design represents?" the instructor asked, his voice now carrying an edge of authority that hadn't been there before. Sarah took a deep breath, knowing that her answer would likely result in more mockery and criticism. "It's based on the seal trident," she said quietly. "The eagle represents freedom, the trident represents Neptune's power over the sea, and the anchor represents the Navy. The stars represent the three basic SEAL specialties: sea, air, and land operations." A murmur went through the crowd of military personnel, and Sarah caught several exchanged glances that she couldn't interpret. Some looked surprised, others seemed skeptical, and a few appeared almost angry. "And what about the Latin text?" the instructor pressed. "Virtus et honor," Sarah replied. "Courage and honor." The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah could hear her own heartbeat as she waited for the inevitable lecture about appropriating military symbols. She could see some of her classmates already smiling in anticipation of her public humiliation. But the instructor's next words surprised everyone. "How do you know so much about SEAL symbolism?" he asked, his tone now more curious than accusatory. "I've studied it extensively," Sarah answered honestly. "I know the history, the selection process, the training requirements, the deployment cycles. I know about Hell Week, the completion rates, the physical and psychological demands. I know about the team's operational history and their role in modern warfare." The instructor looked around at his colleagues, seeming to communicate something through silent glances and subtle nods. Sarah noticed that several of them had moved closer, forming a loose circle around her that felt more protective than threatening. "Miss Martinez." Lieutenant Commander Jackson's voice came from behind her, and she turned to see that he had joined the group. "I couldn't help but overhear your conversation. That's quite an extensive knowledge base you have there." "Yes, sir," Sarah replied, not sure where this was heading. "Tell me," the lieutenant commander continued, "what made you decide to get that particular tattoo design?" Sarah hesitated, knowing that her real answer might sound foolish or presumptuous to these elite warriors. But something in the lieutenant commander's expression encouraged her to be honest. "It represents my goal," she said simply. "I want to be a SEAL." The reaction from her classmates was immediate and predictable. Several of them laughed outright, while others shook their heads in obvious disbelief. Dr. Williams looked mortified, clearly feeling that his student had just embarrassed herself in the entire class. "A SEAL?" one of her classmates said loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Sarah, women can't be SEALs." But the military personnel around her weren't laughing. Instead, they were looking at Sarah with a new level of interest and respect. Lieutenant Commander Jackson stepped closer, studying her face with the same intensity the instructor had shown toward her tattoo. "Miss Martinez," he said carefully, "are you aware that the Navy recently opened all special operations positions to qualified candidates regardless of gender?" Sarah's heart stopped. She had been following the news about women in combat roles, but the implementation of new policies was often slow and complicated. She hadn't realized that the opportunity she had dreamed of might actually be available. "I knew it was being considered," she said quietly, "but I wasn't sure about the timeline or specific requirements." "The timeline," said a new voice from behind the group, "is now." Everyone turned to see who had spoken, and Sarah's breath caught in her throat. Walking toward them was a man whose presence commanded immediate attention and respect. Even without seeing his uniform details clearly, it was obvious from the way every military person in the area suddenly straightened their posture that this was someone very important. The man was tall and lean, with the weathered features of someone who had spent years in harsh environments. His uniform bore insignia that Sarah recognized immediately, and his bearing radiated the quiet confidence of a leader who had been tested in the most demanding circumstances imaginable. As he approached the group, Sarah could see her classmates backing away slightly, intimidated by his obvious authority. But she found herself standing straighter, meeting his gaze directly despite the nervousness she felt. The man stopped directly in front of Sarah and studied her tattoo for a long moment. When he finally looked up at her face, his expression was unreadable, but his eyes held an intensity that made Sarah feel as though he was seeing straight through to her soul. "Young lady," he said in a voice that carried absolute authority, "I need to ask you a very important question." Commander Michael Torres stood before Sarah with the bearing of a man who had led elite warriors through the most dangerous missions imaginable. His uniform displayed the gold trident pin of a SEAL, along with ribbons and commendations that spoke of decades of distinguished service. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of absolute authority. "Young lady, I need to ask you a very important question," he said, his eyes fixed on Sarah's tattoo. "Who authorized that insignia?" The question hit the group like a thunderbolt. Sarah felt her knees go weak as she realized what the commander was implying. Her classmates, who had been snickering moments before, now stood in stunned silence. Even Dr. Williams looked shocked by the unexpected turn of events. "Sir, I don't understand," Sarah managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper. Commander Torres stepped closer, pointing directly at specific elements of her tattoo design. "This isn't just a generic representation of SEAL imagery," he said firmly. "These specific modifications, the star arrangement, the particular style of the eagle's wings, the exact positioning of the Latin text, this is the insignia of SEAL Team 7 Echo Platoon." Sarah felt the world spinning around her. She had never heard of Echo Platoon, had never researched that level of specific unit detail. Her tattoo had been based on a design she found among her father's military papers after his death, but he had been Army, not Navy. "Sir, there must be some mistake," she said shakily. "My father was Army. He never served with the SEALs." Commander Torres studied her face intently. "What was your father's name and rank?" "Sergeant First Class Roberto Martinez," Sarah replied. "He served 3 tours in Afghanistan with the 82nd Airborne." The commander's expression shifted subtly, and Sarah caught him exchanging a meaningful look with Lieutenant Commander Jackson. Something was happening here that she didn't understand, something that involved knowledge she didn't possess. "Miss Martinez," Commander Torres said carefully, "what you just described is your father's official service record. But Roberto Martinez also served in a classified capacity that wouldn't appear on any standard military documentation." Sarah's world tilted on its axis. Her father had never mentioned any other service, had never spoken of Navy operations or special missions beyond his Army deployment. But as she thought back to odd moments from her childhood, late-night phone calls he took in another room, mysterious visits from men who didn't look like typical Army soldiers, the way he sometimes seemed to know things about military operations that weren't in the news. Pieces of a puzzle she hadn't known existed began to fall into place. "My father was Army," she repeated, but her voice lacked conviction. "Your father was many things," Commander Torres said gently. His primary service was indeed with the 82nd Airborne, and he was an exceptional soldier. But Roberto Martinez also participated in joint special operations missions that required his particular skills in languages and cultural intelligence. Lieutenant Commander Jackson stepped forward, holding a tablet that he had been discreetly using during the conversation. "Miss Martinez, your father was attached to several SEAL teams during his deployments for specialized reconnaissance missions. His Arabic language skills and cultural knowledge made him invaluable for operations in certain regions of Afghanistan." "That's impossible," Sarah said, but even as she spoke, she remembered her father's fluency in Arabic, something he had always attributed to academic interest, but had never fully explained. Commander Torres gestured toward her tattoo. "That design isn't something you could have found in any book or website. It's the specific insignia that was created for the joint task force your father worked with. It was worn by a small group of warriors who operated in the highest levels of classified missions." "But why didn't he tell me?" Sarah asked, tears beginning to form in her eyes. "Because he couldn't," the commander replied with obvious respect in his voice. "Roberto Martinez died protecting secrets that are still classified today. The nature of his work with our teams was never officially acknowledged because it was too sensitive and too dangerous for the people involved. Sarah sank onto a nearby bench, overwhelmed by the revelation that her understanding of her father's life had been fundamentally incomplete. Her classmates stood in absolute silence, clearly understanding that they were witnessing something far more significant than they had anticipated. "The tattoo," she said weakly. "I found the design in his papers. I thought it was just something he admired or wanted to remember." "It was something he earned," Commander Torres said firmly. "Your father may not have been officially designated as a SEAL, but he operated alongside our teams and upheld our standards under the most dangerous circumstances. That insignia represents his contribution to missions that saved American lives." Lieutenant Commander Jackson showed Sarah the tablet screen, which displayed a classified after-action report with several names redacted. "Your father is mentioned here as a key contributor to Operation Desert Eagle, a mission that prevented a major terrorist attack on U.S. forces. His work with our team directly led to the capture of a high-value target." Sarah stared at the document, seeing her father's name in the context of elite military operations for the first time. The pride she felt was overwhelming, but it was mixed with grief for all the conversations they would never have, all the stories he had kept to himself to protect operational security. "Miss Martinez," Commander Torres said, his tone shifting to something more official, "I understand that you've expressed interest in pursuing a career in naval special warfare." "Yes, sir," Sarah replied, straightening up despite her emotional state. "Based on what I've observed today, your physical readiness, your knowledge base, and your demonstrated commitment to our values, I'd like to discuss your potential candidacy for our training pipeline." The gasps from her classmates were audible, but Sarah barely heard them. Everything she had worked toward, everything she had endured mockery and criticism for, was suddenly within reach. "Sir, I would be honored to serve," she said, her voice growing stronger. Commander Torres smiled for the first time since approaching the group. "The honor would be ours, Miss Martinez. Your father would be proud to know that his daughter is carrying on his commitment to protecting our nation." Dr. Williams stepped forward, clearly still processing everything that had transpired. "Commander, I owe Miss Martinez an apology. I criticized her tattoo in class without understanding its significance." "Professor Williams," the commander replied, "you couldn't have known. But this young woman has been carrying her father's legacy every day, even when others questioned her right to do so." Sarah looked around at her classmates, seeing their expressions ranging from amazement to embarrassment. The same people who had mocked her tattoo and dismissed her dreams were now looking at her with newfound respect and understanding. "There will be a formal application process," Commander Torres continued, "and the training will be more demanding than anything you can imagine. But if you're truly committed to following in your father's footsteps, we'll give you every opportunity to succeed." As the tour concluded and the group prepared to return to campus, Sarah remained behind to speak privately with Commander Torres and Lieutenant Commander Jackson. They provided her with information about the application process, training requirements, and timeline for the next selection class. "One more thing, Miss Martinez," Commander Torres said as they finished their discussion. "Your father's service record is being reviewed for posthumous recognition. His contributions to naval special warfare operations deserve to be acknowledged, even if they can never be fully publicized." Sarah felt tears streaming down her face as she shook hands with both officers. The tattoo that had been a source of shame and mockery was now revealed as a badge of honor, connecting her to a legacy of service and sacrifice that she was only beginning to understand. On the bus ride back to campus, her classmates peppered her with questions about her father and her plans for military service. The same people who had laughed at her tattoo now wanted to know everything about her background and aspirations. Sarah answered their questions politely, but found herself thinking about her father and the secrets he had carried. That evening, Sarah called Mr. Henderson to quit her job at the diner. When she explained about the Naval Special Warfare opportunity, he was genuinely excited for her and apologetic about the treatment she had received from some customers. "Your father would be proud, honey," he said. "I knew there was more to that tattoo than met the eye." 6 months later, Sarah stood on the beach at Coronado, California, preparing to begin basic underwater demolition SEAL training. She was one of only 3 women in her class, but she felt ready for the challenge ahead. Her father's legacy had brought her to this moment, and she was determined to honor his memory through her own service. The tattoo on her forearm was no longer hidden under long sleeves. It was visible as she performed her first ocean evolution, a symbol of the courage and honor that had guided her father and would now guide her through the most challenging training in the military. As she emerged from the cold Pacific waters after her first training dive, Sarah heard her instructor call out, "Outstanding performance, Martinez. Your father's training you well." Sarah smiled, knowing that in some way her father was indeed still training her, still guiding her toward the warrior she was meant to become. The laughs and mockery were behind her now, replaced by the respect and camaraderie of warriors who understood the true meaning of the insignia she wore with such pride.